सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
For the 10th time as Prime Minister and the last time in this term in government, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke from Red Fort on Independence Day. A few things stood out. If you look at all his speeches in these 10 years, all 10 speeches, they are voluminous, they are wrong. In fact, the shortest was 74 minutes. Today's was sort of the medium length, 94 minutes. But generally, he has many familiar things that he keeps talking about. These range from Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India, to Digital India, inclusion, financial inclusion, Nari Shakti, Swachh Bharat, etc., etc. But each year he comes up with something interesting, something new, and something signals his intent, and mostly his political intent. Sometimes his intent on governance, what he sees as reform, economy, but mostly we look for that one takeaway of his political intent. So today we found one, and then we found quite a bit of discourse leading up to that one intent. So to that extent, it was a well thought out speech in terms of the agenda that he's setting up for 2024. So what is the highlight expression that stands out, or highlight figure that stands out? That's 1,000. That is 1,000 years. So he talked about setting up a 1,000-year agenda for India, that now nobody in India for 1,000 years will make mistakes, will repeat mistakes of the past, etc., etc. Talked about the next 1,000 years, the next millennium, but at the same time talked about the previous millennium, the previous 1,000 years, and that's where he talked about 1200 saal ki gulami, that slavery of 1,000 years or thereabouts. And he takes you right back, and this is early in his speech, he takes you right back without naming any names. He takes you right back, and he says there was an invasion by a small force, and a small Indian principality or a small Indian ruler lost the battle. And because that small Indian ruler lost the battle and the invader won, that set up a cycle of invasions, and one after the other invaders came, they looted India, they humiliated India, they took away India's wealth, and they kept us in slavery for a very long time. Now, you fill in the blanks. If you fill in the blanks, or I dare to fill in the blanks for you, then the invasion is talking about is Muhammad bin Qasim. So Muhammad bin Qasim from the Arab world, and the battle is talking about, and the Indian ruler, he says, lost that battle, was Raja Dahir of Sindh. So Muhammad bin Qasim won that battle and established Islamic rule in one part of the subcontinent, in Sindh. In fact, in Pakistan, that has routinely been celebrated as a kind of national holiday, because that is the day that is hailed as marking the arrival of Islam in the subcontinent. So he marks that day, and then he says after that we continued in slavery. It went on and on. So on the one hand, 1,000 years of slavery, right? First the Muslims, what he sees as Muslim invaders, quote unquote, then the British, then independence, then 75 years of independence, and now he's looking at the future. He has many complaints about what happened during the 75 years that he talks about as he goes ahead, and he has factors that he blames. He has arguments that I will detail for you very briefly, but basically he's saying that we messed up the previous 1,000 years. We must glow for the next 1,000 years. So one millennium versus the other. That is how he's setting up his campaign. Now, as he sets up his campaign for next year, what is it that he's going to be attacking? What are going to be the prongs of his campaign? Is it going to be a single-pronged campaign that is attacking, say, the Gandhi family, as might have been the case in the past? Or is it going to be attacking the India alliance? He doesn't say that. Obviously, he will not name other parties in his Independence Day speech. But he's giving you wide enough hints. not just hints, he's actually setting up his agenda. So he's naming three evils in India. And what are these three evils according to him? Number one is corruption. Number two is dynastic and family rule. And number three, very interestingly and very importantly, number three is appeasement. So when you say appeasement, what you mean is Muslims, because traditionally and now for decades, for almost 100 years, in fact, RSS will be 100 in a couple of years. Almost for 100 years, the RSS has accused the Congress party and the other so-called secular parties of having followed a policy of what they call appeasement, or the expression that they use, tushtikaran, towards the Muslims. So now he is elevated, while the RSS and BJP have always complained about tushtikaran. In fact, his answer to tushtikaran has been Sarvjan Hitay, Sarvjan Sukhay, that is spoke about today as well. That is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, quite literally. Today, he's listed it among three major prongs of his attack in this coming election campaign. So once again, corruption, dynastic and family rule, Parivarvad as he calls it, Bhrashtachar, Parivarvad, Tushtikaran. Corruption, dynastic and family rule, and appeasement. So you now see what the next campaign is going to be. Next, he's setting himself up for a stability versus coalition rule campaign. And he takes you right back, in this case, not 1,000 years, but he takes you back to 2014. And he said 2014, by 2014, people had got fed up of 30 years of coalition rule, which he did not say is unstable, but which he implied was unstable. People now wanted a strong, stable government, a government where conflicting interests of participants in a coalition. He said conflicting interests, I am adding coalition, where conflicting interests of participants in a coalition did not stifle governance. A stable rule now, where compulsions of coalition rule or conflicting interests of coalition partners, or what was called coalition dharma at one point of time, these do not blight governance. So that is how he's setting up his next campaign as well. And then what does he promise in the next campaign? What he promises in the next campaign, of course, greatness, that by 2047, India will be a developed country. And once again, he repeats his earlier message that all young Indians have to remember their duties. You know, ever since he's come to power, he's talked repeatedly about the duties, the citizens' duties, the essential duties or fundamental duties that the Constitution lays down. Now, it's an interesting fact to notice that the original Constitution that Ambedkar gave us, that did not have fundamental duties. These were inserted by Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, through her emergency parliament in its 6th year. So, an illegitimate parliament. She did it by extending the term of that parliament and delaying elections. That parliament came up with the 42nd Amendment. That pretty much abrogated our constitution. That was a bit like creating a second republic in India. So fundamental rights won't matter, and laws passed by a parliament will no longer be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. That wasn't very different from what Netanyahu may have planned initially in Israel. In fact, if anything, that was much more sweeping. She lost power, people of India punished her, Janata government came, Janata government and the Congress party also cooperated, they got together and they repealed the 42nd Amendment. So most of the noxious elements of the 42nd Amendment were repealed. One factor, however, both groups agreed on, the Janata Party as well as the Congress, that is to let fundamental duties remain there. And the Prime Minister has repeatedly talked about that. This also featured, this was the theme of the article he wrote for the New York Times on the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi as well. So once again, he reminds people of their duties, but he says that one, by 2047, we'll be a fully developed country. And then he promises India global greatness and the status of a global guru or a Vishwa Guru, as is the preferred expression in the RSS discourse. And I will give you some examples that he quotes of India's march, in what he sees as India's march in that direction. I will come to that. Now, interestingly, he starts out by saying we become the number 3 economy, etc., etc. But he also notes with some some element of pride. And you will see this picture on my screen, which is taken, which is a screen grab from his speech, when he says that some people think that even in terms of population, we have now become number one in the world. Now, I'm not underlining this or highlighting this or making a note of this out of any sarcasm. I am in fact more inclined to believe that today we are in an era, we are going through an era where most big countries in the world, especially China, Japan has had this problem for a long time, Europe's in the throes of this problem, China has this problem, America might have it in the course of time, unless Americans allow a lot of immigration. The fact is that as countries develop, their population ages and they stop adding more young people to their population. So there, just as China is struggling with a lack of young population, India still has that demographic dividend of age. So that's where having a larger population to begin with is not necessarily a curse, particularly when India's population growth has now slowed down almost to a trickle. So in fact, a larger population base with a much larger percentage of working age people than in many other major economies can be an advantage if you are able to create conditions where you can provide opportunity to these young people. And this is especially so when your population growth rate has now come not just a trickle, but actually you are at a replacement level. So it's not as if India has runaway population growth. Now, this is very interesting considering the fact that I think in 2016, was it, the Prime Minister had actually pointed out to population growth being a big challenge for India. From population growth being a big challenge, for his making a call to people of India to put their heads together to see how to address that problem, for him now to talk with some degree of pride of the fact that India has become number one in the world, even in terms of population, also tells you how the global view of demographics, of population demographics has changed over these 10 years, because the world has seen incredible economic growth and social evolution, and whereby people are producing fewer and fewer babies across the world. So this change in his discourse is also reflective of that change in the mindset. Then of course it does the usual bit of complimenting his team, everybody for having been successful, for having achieved many objectives. He words it smartly, as he often does. So he says, it's for me to reform, for the Prime Minister to reform, for my bureaucracy. He uses the term bureaucracy, for my bureaucracy, who are my limbs, जो मेरे हाथ और पाँव हैं, who are my arms and my legs. So bureaucracy, who are my limbs, it's for them to perform. So I reform, the bureaucracy performs, and the people of India transform. So that's where his slogan of reform, perform and transform comes in. I saw this time in almost every speech in 10 years, he has mentioned diversity and sometimes regional aspirations, but diversity always. This time I found the reference occur more prolifically than in the past. So in fact, my colleague Sajid Ali Mir, and please don't laugh, he put all of Modi's speeches, all 10 of Modi's speeches through ChatGPT to find some common areas. And we found that diversity is one of the areas that figures almost every time. But this time there was a lot more talk about this. This time, in fact, there was a very interesting mention, and you can see the Prime Minister has been doing it ever since the farm law protests started, because those protests were spearheaded by the Sikhs of Punjab. And since then, he started an outreach to the Sikhs, and that continues. So today also there were two references to the Sikhs by way of an outreach. So there was a reference to the fact that his government played a role in rescuing and bringing to India the Swarups of Guru Gobind Singh Sahib, Shri Guru Gobind Singh Sahib, the holy book of the Sikhs, which the Sikhs consider to be their guru now. This government played a role in bringing them to safety from Kabul, from Afghanistan, as the Taliban took over. And also he mentioned in a very adulatory manner the langars or the mass meals that the Sikh community held for people during the pandemic across the world, which got them a lot of the praise. So I see that as more than a little bit of a political outreach to the Sikh community. Then how does India become Vishwaguru? He didn't say Vishwaguru, but he talked about global leadership. He's now been speaking again and again, and you can see that he has made this one of the main planks, one of the main positive planks of of his proposition to the voter for 2024. Of course, he said that next year I'll be back again on 15th of August at Red Fort to unfurl the tricolour and address you as Prime Minister, to which Congress President Mallikarjun Kharge, of course, responded by saying, of course, you can unfurl the tricolour next year, but in your home, not at Red Fort. That goes on in politics. That said, what are the things that he listed where he said India provided leadership to the world? These are the things he said in this speech. He said, first of all, we gave the world a slogan, one sun, one world, one grid. Second slogan, one earth, one health. And he said, unless we worry about the health of human beings, animals and plants all at the same time, we can't look at anybody's health in isolation of the others. And he said the world has accepted it. Then one world, one family, one future. Then his life plan, his life slogan, which is lifestyle for environment, he says all of these have been accepted by the world, which means the world is accepting India's moral, spiritual and intellectual leadership in his view. Then International Solar Alliance, he says again the world has accepted it. Then he said, we talked about biodiversity, so we set up the Big Cat Alliance. The world has appreciated it and they are joining in with this. Then Coalition for Disaster Relief and Infrastructure, particularly he says as climate change takes place, these things will happen even more. And finally, his Sagar scheme. And he says as this goes on and on, as this continues, obviously after people re-elect him, then he said when he's elected back to power, quote unquote, he will continue the fight against corruption, dynastic rule / nepotism and appeasement. And he says this appeasement is actually a blot on national character. In fact, he holds forth on appeasement quite a bit. And he says this appeasement actually blights all of the government social security schemes. The expression he uses is, unko maut ke ghat utar deti hai. It destroys them, it kills them. He said appeasement is actually an enemy of social justice. Government schemes of social justice, as I just mentioned to you, unko ye maut ke ghat utar deti hai. It slaughters them. It kills them. And appeasement is the biggest enemy of development. So he in fact this time has talked more about appeasement or tushtikaran than even about dynastic rule or corruption. Of course, for dynastic rule, he says what this rule means is of the family, for the family, by the family. Now, a couple of other important takeaways. Every prime minister in every speech talks about the poor, Dalits, backward classes, Adivasis. But Prime Minister Modi this time, I think it's the first reference to this expression or this category of fellow Indians by any prime minister in India's history. He talks about Pasmandas. He does not talk about minorities. The pre-BJP prime ministers may have talked about minorities, welfare of minorities along with Adivasi, scheduled castes, that is Dalits, and backward castes. But almost nobody talked about the one category that Narendra Modi has mentioned. I have to do research, but I don't think from my recollection, any prime minister mentioned this category of people. And this category of people are actually Muslims. They are Pasmandas. So Pasmandas are the backward caste or lower caste Muslims. So people who converted to Islam from backward or lower caste. And that is meant to also play the game. I think this is something that I spoke about earlier in a national interest also, that the BJP is now rolling out a politics whereby they are telling the so-called secular parties that if you can play caste, if you can use caste to divide Hindu society, we can also play caste to divide Muslim society. So this is his outrage to Pasmandas in the Muslim society, who, as in the case of the Hindu society, just as in the case of the Hindu society, the scheduled caste, the Dalits, even the tribes who happen to be Hindu are much more populous, much more in number than the upper castes. Among the Muslims, the Pasmandas or so-called Pasmandas have an even larger numbers advantage over what is called as Ashrafs or the Muslim elites or the Muslim upper caste. So this is probably a first time outreach from any Indian Prime Minister to one category of the Muslims while not talking about the Muslims as such. So it was a 94-minute speech, and you know, when the Prime Minister speaks, lines keep coming back to you and you figure out the significance of some as you go on and on, but that's my instant understanding of what are the big political takeaways from it, because he's setting up his campaign for 2024. So remember, 2024 is the election year. 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 2024 is the election Corruption and dynastic rule you've heard about many times. This time you will hear Tushti Karor appeasement a lot more. Also this time you will probably hear about the Pasmandas, or there'll be a Pasmanda outreach of one kind or the other to try and divide the Muslim vote. Also this time you will find, at least so far, you will find that foreign policy, national security, terrorism, at least so far, we don't have evidence that those will paint that big or that heavily in the campaign. Of course, we don't know what events might unfold in the run-up to the campaign as Pulwama did the last time.